Following the news today in Lebanon sometimes feels like having a look at a perfect storm. Since 2019, the country has been grappling with an economic and financial meltdown, with most bank accounts frozen and the national currency losing 90% of its value. For 2 years now, the country has been left with no president and with just an acting government. And these, on the top of a refugee crisis, constant energy outages, and endemic issues such as corruption, mismanagement, and clientelism. And then the war in the south came. Since October 8th of last year, Hezbollah and the Israeli army have been trading fire along and beyond the border. Tens of thousands of residents on both sides have been displaced, and the risk of a full-scale war has never fully disappeared. My name is Mattia Serra, and today we are going to look at this compounded crisis. We are going to reflect on the developments of these past few months in Lebanon, and we'll try to see what the future holds for this country and its population. And we are going to do so with three speakers that I'm really glad to introduce to you today. Let me start with Karim Emile Bitar, who is a professor of international relations and the former director at the Institute of Political Science at the Saint Joseph University of Beirut. Among many things, he's also a fellow at the Institute for International and Strategic Relations in Paris and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Karim, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We have Leila Dagher, who is an associate professor of economics at the Lebanese American University, where she's also serving as an assistant to the president for public policy. And finally, we have David Wood, who is the senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, David, for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So before we start with the questions, before we start with the discussion, just a small housekeeping rule for everyone. There is a small box for the audience for the Q&A. So if you have some questions for the speakers, just type your questions on the chat, and I'll be looking at them and select some of them for our speakers. So let me start with David. So we all remember what happened on August 25, There was this attack and counterattack by Hezbollah and Israel. Israel launched an operation against Hezbollah, and at the same time, Hezbollah launched some, 300 rockets towards Israel, and it was a sort of complicated situation to look at. Both sides claimed that their operations were a success, and we are left in this kind of limbo where we don't really understand exactly what happened. We all know the background. We all remember the Masjid al-Shams attack that killed some 12 children in the Golan Heights at the end of July. We remember the killing of Shukr in Beirut and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and everybody was awaiting during August for this retaliation by Hezbollah and Iran. So my question for you, Dave, would be, what's your take of the events of August 25, and in your opinion, in what situation are we at the moment?
Thanks for having me, Mattia. And in answer to your question, I think that until now, and what are we, about 2 weeks after that Sunday where we saw the retaliation and counter-retaliation, or preemptive attack and retaliation, both sides sort of framed it differently. But I think that we've ended up in the place that a lot of people expected us to in the short term, which is that there was a clear signaling by Hezbollah to Israel after its retaliation, which I think we can all agree was moderate, and was not as intense in its overall impact as the original operation by Israel, which occurred in the middle of Dagher and claimed not only the life of Fuad Shukr, but also several civilians. It was deliberately focused on military targets, and it's disputed between Israel and Hezbollah about how successful it was in striking those targets. But when I say that we've ended up in roughly where we expected to be in the short term, that is that we have seen that ever since, the clashes across the border have not been at the same intensity as that Sunday. However, it's worth noting a couple of things. Number one is that this does not mean that there's returned any serious stability to the southern border. There are daily cross-border attacks. Israel has been carrying out more targeted operations. Hezbollah has been retaliated by attacking mostly military targets, but also over the weekend evacuated civilian communities. where admittedly the risk of taking civilian casualties is lower. So that's number one, is that the intensity, I would say, has gone down to about the level that it was before the operation in Dagher in late July, which triggered these latest concerning escalations. And number two is that there's a risk, I think, for the long term, which means that we cannot necessarily interpret the supposed closing of this chapter as getting towards the end of the story of this war. And that is because, I mean, there are some who fear that by retaliating moderately, Hezbollah might have provided some level of encouragement for those within the Israeli political and security establishments who believe that now, at a time when Hezbollah is signaling that it will retaliate, but not at the same level of intensity for attacks in Lebanon against its personnel and infrastructure. And also while the international community is largely focused on the war in Gaza and increasingly on operations by Israel on the West Bank, that this might actually be a time to continue severe strikes against Hezbollah with that distraction in place and with the kind of assurance that Israel's leadership might not have had, in fact, certainly didn't have before the 8th of October last year, that if they were to carry out these intense targeted operations against Hezbollah, that they could expect a massive retaliation for it. Whereas the pattern has been over the past 11 months that Hezbollah's retaliations have been constant, but not at the same level of intensity.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'll shift to Karim in this moment. Karim, do you agree with David's views on the events of August 25? And more in general, what's your view on the current events? I mean, the current situation on the south. And also, let me add, how do you see these clashes, and what impact do you think they're having on the domestic political environment in Lebanon?
The way David has described the events of the past few weeks was definitely spot on. We have been on some sort of emotional roller coaster. When I saw the subject that you chose for this panel, Lebanon teetering on the edge, I sort of smiled because, we've been using these expressions for decades. Lebanon at the crossroads, Lebanon dancing on a volcano, Lebanon teetering on the edge. But for the past few weeks, we had the impression that all these old cliches really became reality. And we were genuinely on the brink of an all-out regional war. I think things could have gone differently. Any miscalculation could have led Lebanon to a quote-unquote apocalypse, because you were mentioning the domestic political scene in Lebanon, and if there is something that almost all Lebanese agree on, is that the Lebanese state, the Lebanese institutions, and the Lebanese society are simply not ready to handle a new Israeli attack on Lebanon or a new all-out war. Lebanon today is on the verge of state collapse. The economic crisis that we have been witnessing is literally unprecedented, one of the worst crises worldwide since 1850. Lebanese society is extremely polarized. Even though Hezbollah is today arguably militarily stronger than it was in 2006, it can no longer rely on the political support and popular support that it had 15 or 20 years ago, because Hezbollah's behavior in the past couple of decades has alienated a significant proportion of its erstwhile allies. Hezbollah lost popular support in the Sunni street, in the Christian street, and even within its own constituency, large segments were expressing frustration and were very clearly saying that they realized that Lebanon could simply, at this point in time, would not be strong enough to confront an Israeli aggression. Hezbollah might be strong militarily, but economically and socially, and when it comes to the infrastructure and the international support, Lebanon would have been completely at a loss. It would have been unable to mobilize and rally support. Even the Lebanese diaspora would have been unlikely to offer the same level of support that it offered in 2006. So we came very close to witnessing the collapse of the state of Greater Lebanon, because we do not have a president right now. We do not have a government. Our government is simply a caretaker government. Most of our institutions are dysfunctional. So had we been in the midst of a war today, there would have been a risk that we would not have been able to rebuild the state of Greater Lebanon that was born in 1920 and that gained its independence in 1943. So we are still at the crossroads. We are still teetering on the edge. But I think, as David said, we might have gained a short respite because there is this balance of terror between Israel and Hezbollah, because there was a diplomatic, frenetic effort on the part of the United States, France, and some Gulf countries and Oman to try to mediate something. And we had these orchestrated, choreographed reprisals that made sure to offer a face-saving exit to Hezbollah after the assassination of one of its founders in Beirut, and also a face-saving exit for Benjamin Netanyahu, who can now claim that he assassinated a leader of Hamas in Iran and the leader of Hezbollah in Beirut. But we could still witness clashes at the border. The core issue remains unsolved, and as long as there is no ceasefire on Gaza, as long as there is no Western pressure on Israel, things could erupt at any point in time. We are still dancing on a volcano. This old cliche is unfortunately truer than ever.
Thank you so much, Karim, and thank you so much also for the reference to the title. I do understand your point, of course, and it's very sad to be in this situation today. But thank you so much for your reply, because you mentioned a lot of very important elements that we are going to elaborate on later on. So I wanted to move now to Leila Dagher. I know we have some kind of internet connection issues, but we'll try and hopefully that's going to work out. Leila, if you can hear us in this moment, could you perhaps... Okay, perfect. Can you give us a picture of Lebanon's economy before the war, and also tell us a little bit more about the economic impact of this war for Lebanon?
Sure, Mattia. Again, I apologize for the internet connection. So as you've all mentioned, Lebanon has been grappling with a prolonged and severe economic crisis since October 2019. It has been characterized by the World Bank, as Karim said, as one of the top 3 most severe global crises since 1850. So the country was already in a fragile state well before the onset of the Gaza war in October 2023. The overlapping nature of these crises, and I should also mention here that we also faced COVID, the port of Beirut explosion, and so many different things as well. So this makes it challenging to disentangle their individual effects and consequently to quantify the specific economic impact of the ongoing conflict. Each crisis, from the financial collapse to the energy shortages and now the regional war, exacerbates the other, creating a complex and intertwined set of challenges that complicate any precise assessment of the war's additional economic toll. However, I will try my best. So I'll be looking at different economic indicators. Let's start with the currency. The Lebanese pound has lost about 98% of its value against the US dollar on the parallel market. The exchange rate had stabilized at around 90,000 Lebanese pounds to the dollar in mid-2023, so it's been over a year. Remains to be seen if a new budget with larger deficits will trigger another round of depreciation, but so far the war has not had a direct impact on the exchange rate. As we know, in March 2020, Lebanon defaulted on its sovereign debt for the first time in history. Since 2018, Lebanon's credit ratings from agencies such as Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's have sharply deteriorated due to escalating economic, political, and financial crises. We have been downgraded repeatedly, but nothing new so far. The GDP, which has been contracting since 2018, was expected to grow for the first time by 0.2% in 2023. And this would have been attributed to an increase in consumption stemming from a strong tourism season, a stable inflow of remittances, and increased dollarization of salaries. However, unfortunately, the outbreak of the Gaza war in October 2023 devastated Lebanon's fragile economy, pushing the country back into recession with a projected GDP contraction of 0.6 to 0.9%. So here we can see the direct effect. Remittances, a vital economic lifeline for Lebanon, have remained resilient since the onset of the crisis in 2019, averaging around 20-25% of the GDP every year. The economic... Yeah.
Go ahead, Leila, we can hear you.
Yeah, the economic crisis, now I'm talking a little bit about inflation. So we reached triple digits with rates of around 155% in 21, 171% in 22, and 221% in 23. This, of course, devastated the purchasing power of Lebanese citizens. The war further exacerbated inflation, which was already at 71% almost by March 2024, as supply chains were disrupted and import costs surged. Monetary poverty also has tripled from 12% in 2012 to 44% in 2022. Again, we see such figures when we talk about multidimensional poverty. Unfortunately, these figures are not released periodically, so it remains to be seen, the effect of the war. Unemployment surged, with the rate rising again from 11% in 2019 to 30% in 2022. Youth unemployment hitting around 50% that year. And to note here, very important, that the incidents on the shipping industry in the Red Sea have led to an increase in shipping and insurance costs, which have also translated into higher prices, fueling inflation, the figures I've just mentioned, and exacerbating poverty as well. Talking a little bit about the infrastructure, since 2019, electricity, water, and healthcare has been on the brink of collapse since then, with fuel shortages causing rolling blackouts and severely limiting access to public services. Healthcare system has already been under strain, struggled further due to the lack of essential resources. Tourism revenues, which had shown some signs of recovery, unfortunately have plummeted again as conflict disrupted air travel and caused a sharp drop in hotel occupancy rates to below 10% at one point. Inbound passengers numbers fell by 23% in October 23, with airlines suspending flights and the national carrier Middle East Airlines cutting its flight schedule by 50%. I can give some examples. So a guest house reported 60% decline in bookings in 23 compared to the previous year. Of course, now it's even worse. Hotel and restaurant activity suffered massive losses, with some businesses seeing an 80% drop in weekday activity. Coming to, I think the worst part of the conflict is the widespread displacement within the country, particularly from border towns and villages. So as of December 2023, there were 64,000 internally displaced persons. I've been hearing some numbers above 100,000 now. The conflict also has caused significant physical damage to infrastructure, agriculture, and forestry, particularly along the southern border, where the war has resulted in ravaged villages and farmland. Lebanon now faces the looming threat of a complete economic collapse, with the war worsening already critical conditions. Unemployment and poverty rates have reached unprecedented levels, and vital public services have been severely disrupted. The spillover effects from the conflict have deepened Lebanon's economic challenges, creating a vicious cycle of inflation, poverty, and instability. Comprehensive economic reforms are urgently needed, as we always say, to stabilize the country and secure international financial support for a recovery to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila. So you put a lot of things on the plate, and thank you so much also for explaining a little bit more about the context of the economic collapse of Lebanon, and also for mentioning several issues that were clearly important. You said that there was no impact, let's say, on the exchange rate, which remained constant, and not that much impact on remittances, but then, of course, a lot of impact on the tourism sector. Then, of course, the damage on infrastructures, houses, and farms in the south. So, a lot of economic challenges, and we are going to elaborate a little bit more later on the possible policy solutions for this. But I wanted to go back to Karim, if that's possible, because Karim, you mentioned something. Karim, not there. Okay, never mind. We'll go to David. So perhaps I simply ask you the questions that I was thinking about while listening to Karim. Karim, of course, mentioned the regional and the international dimensions. He referred to, of course, the war in Gaza as being the catalyst of this entire situation. So, what's your take about the mediation efforts by international actors at this moment? Do you think that they will and can be successful in this context? Or, of course, without no ceasefire in Gaza, everything for Lebanon is simply useless?
So I think that the idea that you finished on there is probably the closest to the truth, like the second of the two options you presented. And I think also that the mediating parties are aware of this. So there was a point earlier in the conflict where I think that there was a hope amongst not just Israel's leaders, but also allies in the US and the US and its performance of its mediation role, as well as other mainly Western countries, that the mediation could separate out the two conflicts, and that potentially there could be some kind of return of stability to the border between Israel and Lebanon, even if there wasn't a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Now, of course, that was despite the very clear signaling from Hezbollah, at least from, I believe it was the 3rd of November onwards, when Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah first explained Hezbollah's strategic posture of maintaining a support front for Gaza and the Palestinian cause more generally. So I think that we've now reached a point, and we've been here for a few months, where the mediating parties have accepted that it will not really be feasible for there to be a new security arrangement at the Israeli-Lebanese border without a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. I think that much has become clear. On the other hand, we do know that parties involved with the mediation are confident that the main building blocks have been discussed indirectly, obviously, between the parties and might be in place, depending, of course, on the political situation on the ground if there is a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. But until then, I think that the reason that we can be relatively confident that there wouldn't be an end to the cross-border clashes between Hezbollah and Israel is that Hezbollah, while it has indicated, as me and Karim were saying earlier, that it does not, it would prefer to avoid a full-scale war, has staked a lot ideologically in maintaining that support front for Gaza until there's a permanent end to the conflict there. So for that reason, I believe that any mediation efforts to restore stability at Israel's northern border and Lebanon's southern border hinges on a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, which just, of course, emphasizes the need for the international community led by the United States to really push the parties to conclude a permanent ceasefire without delay.
Thank you so much, David. Karim, if you can hear me now,
Yes, I can hear you. I have a power outage.
But then it disappeared. Okay. Okay, then a follow-up question for David. There is much talking, especially in Italy, since we got some troops in southern Lebanon, about the role of UNIFIL and about the feasibility of this, overall mission. The mandate of UNIFIL has been just renewed a couple of weeks ago. But, what's your idea on this entire debate? And what's your idea about the forces? the mandate of UNIFIL still feasible? Was it ever feasible to begin with? Or, is the future of this mission at stake?
To be blunt, I'm not sure that UNIFIL's mandate, as it's written, was ever really achievable, but that certainly does not mean that UNIFIL is not a very valuable peacekeeping mission. So we know that UNIFIL, unfortunately, has become a political punching bag for both sides, for Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, increasingly in recent years, has criticized UNIFIL as effectively working alongside Israel and spying on the resistance, as it frames it. And Israel has said that UNIFIL is toothless and does not do enough to remove all armed non-state actors, most prominently, of course, Hezbollah, from the area south of the Litani River, as per UN Security Council Resolution 1701. However, I think that this conflict has reminded us of something that we really already knew, and that is that UNIFIL still does do incredibly valuable work in trying to maintain limits or provide off-ramps from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And the main way that it does this is through providing channels of communication and an ability to help the parties to resolve misunderstandings and to de-escalate situations. Now, this is something that UNIFIL has continued to do during the conflict. There were several notable examples, particularly at the start of the conflict, where UNIFIL was essential in ensuring that one party or the other better understood the other's intentions, and that both sides still would prefer to avoid a full-scale war. And that role continues until now. And I also believe that UNIFIL has a very valuable role to play in any new security arrangements for the border, should there be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and discussions to bring stability back to the south of Lebanon. So for those reasons, while UNIFIL's literal mandate might be very difficult for it to achieve, it still does incredibly valuable work that should continue to receive the support of the international community.
Much, David. A very difficult mandate indeed, but a very important channel of communication between the two parts. Leila, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question to the things that you were mentioning before in your intervention.
Sure.
You referred briefly about the need for economic reforms. So perhaps could you please elaborate a little bit more about that? And perhaps also mention something about the banking sector, which we know is one of the key sectors that needs reform today.
Sure. So I can give an overview of the status of each of the reforms that were listed in the staff-level agreement that Lebanon had signed in April 2022 with the IMF. And the first one being the banking sector restructuring. So on the one hand, the IMF has called for a comprehensive restructuring of Lebanon's banking system to address the insolvency of banks, establish a clear framework for distributing the massive losses, and to protect depositors, particularly the small ones. On the other hand, no significant progress has been made in this area. Although several plans have been proposed, they have either stalled in Parliament or faced opposition from stakeholders unwilling to bear the losses. As a result, many banks remain insolvent and depositors continue to face many restrictions in accessing their funds. The second one is the capital control law that we have heard many discussions about it. So again, on the one hand, the IMF stresses the need for a capital, or had stressed several times the need for a capital control law to legally manage and limit the transfer of foreign currency abroad, providing a legal framework for equitable distribution of the remaining assets. But formal capital controls have not been implemented. Only some favored few have been able to transfer their funds. So again, no formal capital control law has been enacted despite repeated pressure. Several drafts have been debated and discussed at length, but political disagreements and opposition from banking interests have stalled the process. So as of 2024, as of now, the absence of a capital control mechanism continues to prolong the uncertainty in Lebanon's financial system. Third is the banking secrecy law. So here again, the IMF has emphasized the need to overhaul Lebanon's banking secrecy laws, which already existed. They have historically facilitated corruption and money laundering by shielding individuals from scrutiny. The reforms should enable greater transparency and accountability in the financial system. So here we do have some limited progress. In 2022, Lebanon passed amendments to the banking secrecy law, but these minor amendments have been criticized as insufficient by several parties. While the amendments introduce some level of transparency, they still fall short of fully dismantling the secrecy regime that has long protected financial misconduct. And then there's the forensic audit on the central bank. So a comprehensive forensic audit of the central bank is crucial to assess its financial situation, uncover any mismanagement, and ensure accountability within the institution. There was an audit led by Alvarez and Marsal, which had faced multiple delays due to a lack of cooperation from the central bank and other parties. While the audit has resumed, transparency remains limited, and the full extent of the findings have not been made public. And 3 more points. So we have the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing. So the AML CTF. Lebanon is required to strengthen these systems to improve financial transparency and align with international standards. This effort is closely tied to the reform of banking secrecy laws to better combat financial crimes. Again, here, some limited progress has been made, especially with amendments to the banking secrecy law. However, implementation remains very weak, and further institutional reforms are needed to ensure the effectiveness of the AML CTF framework. Debt restructuring. The IMF requires Lebanon to adopt a debt restructuring strategy to make its public debt sustainable in the future. This involves negotiating with creditors, reducing the debt burden, and ensuring that new borrowing is done under transparent terms. Again, here, no significant progress has been made. Lebanon has struggled to develop a clear strategy, and political deadlock has prevented meaningful negotiations with creditors. The country's debt remains unsustainable and further deepening its financial crisis. And finally, the exchange rate unification. We've had multiple exchange rates since 2019, official, black market, etc., customs rate, and so on. So these have led to severe economic distortions, as we all know. The IMF required Lebanon to unify the exchange rate, allowing for a market-determined exchange rate that reflects the true value of the pound, of the Lebanese pound, to stabilize the currency and reduce economic distortions. Here again, some progress has been made towards unifying the exchange rate, which has helped contain exchange rate depreciation and stabilize the money supply. However, the process remains incomplete, and further steps are indeed required to fully implement this reform. Lebanon's progress in implementing these banking reforms has been slow and incomplete, as we've seen, largely due to political paralysis, vested interests, and resistance from the political elite. The country, as we've said before, has been facing a prolonged political crisis, which has delayed meaningful reform efforts. The IMF and the international community, they continue to stress that these reforms are essential for unlocking financial aid and addressing the country's prolonged economic and banking crises.
Thank you, Leila. Once again, you covered a lot of ground. And of course, all of these reforms, they all need a political class which is, up for the task and willing to do so.
Sure.
But before discussing this, there was something that I wanted to talk about with Karim, because Leila mentioned the central bank. And one of the big news of the past few days has been, we all know, the arrest of Riad Salami, who used to be the chief of the central bank. So Karim, what's your take on this arrest? Is this a difficult question? We all know that impunity is a major issue in Lebanon. But a difficult question for you, is this really the end of impunity in Lebanon, or just something that happened just happened once and that's it?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure this is the end of impunity. Like most Lebanese, I have mixed feelings about what happened in the past few days. Many people feel vindicated. They have been denouncing Riad Salame's corruption for years. He was not only the governor of the central bank, he was like the sort of the chief financial officer of the entire Lebanese political financial establishment, which works like a mafia, to be very blunt. While it is tempting to think that he got his comeuppance, that suddenly the Lebanese justice system had some sort of moral awakening and decided to finally interrogate him and arrest him. But when we know the history of this country, when we know the rampant impunity that has been going on for decades, when it comes to financial crimes and also when it comes to the Beirut blast, there are reasons to be skeptical. And many people are afraid that something fishy is happening, that he could have been arrested only temporarily on relatively minor charges in order to prevent Lebanon from being grey-listed. It is very doubtful that from one day to the next, the pillars of the Lebanese establishment, the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, and the caretaker Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, who were defenders of Riad Salame over the years, it is surprising, it would be extraordinarily surprising if they decided suddenly to throw him under the bus. It is a possibility. However, Riad Salame is a man who knows too much. He has the secrets of the entire Lebanese political and financial establishment. He is smart enough to have protected himself, to put most of the data on the cloud. If something were to happen to him while he is under arrest, he could, one of his associates could suddenly decide to disclose all this information that could bring down dozens of Lebanese politicians and bankers and security officials. So the most likely scenario is that while they were starting to face international pressure from the United States, from other countries, when there was a risk that in the fall new figures would be indicted by the European justice system, the local Lebanese justice decided to act sort of preemptively to give an impression, to sort of do some window dressing and pretend that it is doing its job properly. And the Lebanese officials think that this might be enough to gain some time and to prevent Lebanon being grey-listed. The other unfortunate truth is that Riad Salame might no longer be the governor of the central bank, but his policies are still hovering over us. We have yet to turn the page of this financial wizardry, of these financial engineerings, of this reliance on speculation, on a rent-based economy that brought Lebanon to this financial collapse in 2019, because Lebanon neglected to support the productive sectors of its economy, neglected to invest in its technological know-how, in its human resources, in agriculture, and focused exclusively on real estate, banking, tourism. The time has come today to open a new page.
Lost. Okay, that was a pity because he was saying some really interesting things. So, David, I think I'll go back to you.
I'm the last man standing, so you have to.
Yeah, the last man standing. Thank you so much for that. Karim was also mentioning the international dimension and this international pressure. One tool, of course, are sanctions. But do you think there is anything else that can be done? Are these, instruments being used properly, or is this situation simply too difficult to be tackled at the international level?
So I think just to add, really, to build on what Karim was saying about this discussion of accountability, I remember that a former governor of the Central Bank of Iceland came out to Lebanon to give a talk 2 years ago, and he explained what the approach was of Iceland's central bank and the government more generally to deal with the financial collapse that happened in Iceland during the global financial crisis. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, 36 senior financial elites were sent to jail as a consequence of their actions in the lead up to the financial crisis in Iceland. So almost 5 years into the crisis, the arrest, not the imprisonment, by the way, but the arrest pending further prosecution of Riad Salama, admittedly the kingpin of the financial system for the past 30 years, or the 30 years leading up to the crisis, doesn't mean particularly much, I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, because unless it is the catalyst for many more arrests, and I think, as Karim pointed out, the idea of that level of widespread uniform accountability throughout the corrupt political and financial systems in Lebanon would go against the grain of modern Lebanese history, unfortunately. So while I understand why people might be tentatively optimistic or hopeful about the arrest of the Riad Salama as a new dawn for accountability in Lebanon, we would need to see a lot more evidence that this is a serious change to get truly excited, I think. And just more generally, in terms of the obstacles to change in Lebanon, I think that the real question that the international community is grappling with is how to create political will amongst Lebanon's leaders, both in the political and financial spheres, to actually change. Because it's clear that the post-Civil War system, the economic order does not work. And I think that the majority of Lebanon's leaders are aware of that. But there is such a lack of trust between those different leaders, both in terms of who will pay for the debts of the past and who will get to construct the new political order, that there's a kind of standoff where nobody is willing, none of the leaders, or a critical mass of the leaders, are not willing to actually give anything up, lest they find that they are the party that loses out to the detriment of their rivals. So for that reason, we've seen in the past 5 years that the strategy of Lebanon's political elites has been to do nothing. And that strategy seemed unthinkable in October 2019, when there were nationwide protests and a real optimism about potential regime change and reforms. But until now, that very cynical strategy has worked, and doing nothing has actually worked to the advantage of the elites and against the interests of the Lebanese people.
Thank you so much, David. I think we'll finish the panel with this final reflection of yours. It was a really interesting, although challenging conversation because of the connection issues, but I think that's part of the reality of discussing Lebanon with the Lebanese. So thank you so much to our audience for listening to us, and thank you directly to all of our speakers. Thank you to Karim Bitar, thank you to Leila Dagher, and thank you to David Wood for joining us today. It was an interesting conversation, and I hope there is going to be a chance to continue this further down the road in Beirut, in Milan, or elsewhere. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Mattia.
Thank you.